There are lots of people who know exactly what's going on in the world, and they know why things are happening, and they can tell you the precise reasons for all of the challenges we're dealing with today. Count me out. I don't claim to know the ways of God. I don't claim to understand why God does what he does. As I often tell people, I'm in sales, not management. It is, however, extremely compelling to note that in this week's Torah portion, both the terminology quarantine and social isolation show up for the first time in human history. This, the first Parsha, or doubleheader Parsha, that follows the holiday of Pesach. This year's Passover, our hopes were sky high. Unfortunately, none of our great hopes for redemption have materialized as of yet, and here we are going back to everyday life. Yisru Chag, the day after Pesach passed, and then it was Shabbat, and now we're beginning a new week. Most of us aren't really going to work, or aren't continuing to live the kinds of lives we were used to. Like I said, count me out from those smug rabbis who claim to know why God's doing what he does. I don't know, but it is incredible to note that in this Torah portion, we hear about a paranormal condition, which is called tsaras. It's essentially a dermal lesion. It has a white or bright appearance, and it's so different from the rest of the flesh-colored skin that it actually projects the image of some kind of depth. And what happens, says the Torah, in chapter 13, verse 4, if we have a baheres levana, we have this white spot, and it is ba'oir b'sarai, it's on the flesh, on the skin, but it doesn't really seem to be deeper. Its appearance is not, shall we say, more shallow than the unaffected skin. So what happens then? The Torah says, the hizgir hakohen. Then the kohen must quarantine the person. And then there's a period of quarantine that lasts for 7 days. And after the period of quarantine, we come and take a look again. And we see what has changed. Pretty compelling. Later on, in the same chapter, in verse 45 and 46, we go on to speak about somebody who is a confirmed Metzora, a person who is definitely suffering from this paranormal condition. The Torah says that person who is certainly afflicted, who has now been diagnosed as having tsaras, the person who has this lesion has to call out to others that he's defiled. And then, and I quote, Kol yemei asher hanega bai, all the days in which the lesion remains upon him, bodod yeshiv, he sits in social isolation, isolated outside the camp, away from other people. As the Torah goes on to say, michutz lamachane, he must be outside of the camp or the settled area. And as we will hear, this isn't just punishment, but rather a corrective, reciprocal situation for the Metzora. So here we are looking at a Parsha that has words that have become seared into our consciousness: quarantine and social isolation. And they show up right in this week's Torah portion, and we, Hasidim, know that the Alter Rebbe taught and the subsequent Rebbeim promulgated this idea as B'daf Lev Miditzait. We must live with the times. And that doesn't only mean to study the Torah, which is nice. It doesn't only mean to learn the ideas that are articulated in Torah, but actually to live with them. So this is relatively easy to live with on the surface. Quarantine. We know what that is. The notion of isolation, forced social isolation. What's the deeper message, though? Well, here's something that Rebbe once shared with us, and being very careful to tell you I don't know why things are happening, I do think we can venture to learn some kind of lesson, or to seek some kind of uplifting, optimistic, and positive perspective. And it goes something like this. The name of the Parsha that talks about the Metzora is Tazria. The Parsha, this week's Torah portion, opens with the words, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, Moses is enjoined, commanded to speak to the children of Israel and to tell them about the laws of ritual defilement, the first of which is connected to pregnancy and childbirth. Isha ki Tazria, a woman who seeds, v'yolda, and then gives birth. Now the term Tazria is related to the notion of zera, or seed. Literally it translates as a woman who seeds. However, Rabbi Saadia Gaon, in his translation of the Torah, renders the word Tazria as harata. Hara means pregnancy, meaning a woman who has achieved a pregnancy. And a pregnancy is a period of incubation, during which time a zygote turns into a human being. But the Parsha essentially is all about new life. The Parsha is about birth. But the vast, overwhelming majority of the Parsha does not focus on childbirth. That's just the first couple of verses. In fact, it almost exclusively talks about the Metzora. Now, I know Metzora is not something that you and I are familiar with in today's day and age. However, let me just share with you that the Gemara in Masechet Nedarim tells us that the concept of Metzora, well, it's not just an unsavory and uncomfortable situation to be in, but the Gemara tells us, Tanya, we learned, Arba'a chashuvim kemes. There are 4 circumstances, situations that people might be in that's likened to death itself. And the Gemara begins to enumerate only a person who's impoverished, and then the Gemara says, Umetzora, the person who is stricken with this paranormal condition. Why do we have to emphasize that this person is essentially the living dead? I mean, it's bad enough the person's a Metzora. It's bad enough this person is in quarantine and now socially isolated from the rest of the world. Why do we have to kind of stick it in his face and say, hey, Metzora, you're basically the living dead? Well, the Tosfos in his commentary says something very interesting. V'nafke mine, the difference of this teaching, I mean, the point that's being made is limiboi alayhu rachami, that if you see somebody who's a Metzora, you shouldn't just feel bad and empathize. You should pray on their behalf. You should ask Hashem, oy vey, this is terrible. Please, God, can you relieve them from their suffering? And of course, I think that very much speaks to us in our day and age. We're all frustrated, and any of us might be saying, dear God, enough already. Please, have Rachmanis. This is not a way to live. Very interestingly, the Maharsha, in his commentary on this Gemara, asks a similar question. Maharsha says, okay, so why is it that we have to emphasize this notion that the person who is in a Metzora state is choshev kameis, is considered as if he's dead? And the Maharsha says something fascinating. He says this is so that you might understand and know that the notion of a Metzora is shkula kameis nira, it seems, says the Maharsha, de le'inyan she'ein chayov chayin. It's not a life. The Metzora is not dead, but you really can't say he's living. He says choshev kameis because this is not the ein chayov chayin. It's just not a way to live. I was recently talking to an acquaintance, and he said to me, you know, we're alive, but we aren't living. This is not the stuff that life is made of. Sitting home, isolated from others, in quarantine from the whole world. And so there's a really interesting, if you will, kind of relationship between the Metzora and between our current situation. The Metzora, he's not living. The Metzora, he needs divine mercy. Of course, both could be said for us in today's day and age. But here, my friends, is the point I want to make. I'm being very careful to emphasize. I am not, N-O-T, not telling you that this is some kind of punishment. I am not telling you that we know why God is doing this. I'll leave it to those misguided fools who think that they have the ability to psychoanalyze God and then prophesize and tell you what that's about. I don't understand. I don't know why God does what he's doing. All I do know is that the responsibility to respond appropriately is ours. We don't get to choose the circumstances. We do choose how we react. So let's talk about the Metzora for a moment. The Metzora, whose circumstances are so unsavory that the Talmud says he's like dead. How and why does this happen? Well, we do have reasons for the Metzora. The Rambam, Maimonides, in the end of his collection of laws, which speak about the governing principles of Tumas Tzoras, the ritual impurity that is engendered through the Metzora, goes on to say in chapter 16, Halacha Yud, subsection 10, he says this business of tzoras has nothing to do with contagium. It's not some kind of physiological phenomenon that could be diagnosed and healed. He calls it something that is eino miminhago shel olam. This is not connected to nature as we know it. Ella, rather, ot ufele haya beYisrael. This was a wondrous sign, a miraculous kind of occurrence that would happen to the Jewish people, kedei lahazhiron milashon hara, to turn them away from the sordid path of gossip and slander. And so when a person got tzaras, you knew that this was a person who was misaper b'lashon hara, a person who continuously engaged in gossip and slander against others. And the Rambam goes on to say how first there would be a change in the walls of his home, and if that didn't work, he didn't get the message, the Chesterfield would start to turn colors, and then ultimately his clothes would experience discoloration until finally mishtane oiroi, the person's own skin would be affected. And what happens then? V'yiya muvdal u'mefursam levadai. This person would then be quarantined, isolated from all others. So much so that this person would no longer engage in wicked gossip monging and slanderous speech, which is lashon hara, mockery of others, and gossip. And here, my dear friends, is the point that I want to share with you. As mentioned before, isn't it strange that the Parsha is called Tazria? I mean, the notion of growth, even if it means pregnancy, but it's still something that speaks about new life and fresh growth. And the entire Parsha is populated by something which is choshev kameis, something which is considered like dead. Why call a Parsha, she will cause to grow, which is the literal meaning of Tazria, when that's not what the Parsha is about? It's rather interesting to note that not everybody calls the Parsha Tazria. In fact, the Magen Avram quotes the Saadia Gaon himself calls it Parshas Isha. He calls it the Parsha of woman, which doesn't help us that much because it's not really talking about a woman per se. It's talking about a man or a woman who might experience this situation. Maimonides calls it Parshas Isha ki Tazria, and that doesn't help us that much either. But interestingly, in the Magen Avram in Siman Tov Chof Ches, the laws of Rosh Chodesh, chapter 428 of the Shulchan Aruch, the Magen Avram clearly calls it Parsha of Tazria. Well, the Rebbe says that the answer to this mystery could perhaps also be a very powerful lesson for us in our day and age. The point is this. The Metzora is indeed in a lousy circumstance or situation. He's isolated from all others. However, the Torah wants us to know that this is not a punitive measure in which God is doing something to harm or to exact some kind of vengeance from the Metzora. But rather, this is a just and it's a corrective reciprocal punishment because the person who was involved in tzoras caused a rift. He caused separation. He caused isolation. He caused people to quarantine themselves from others. Sometimes he could have broken up or hurt marriages or divided friends because of his gossip and slander. And as Rambam pointed out to us, the reason for the social isolation is so that the Metzora will have time to realize how uncomfortable it is to be isolated from others. And in turn, he'll mend his ways. Well, my friends, I'm not suggesting this is a punishment that we can know or understand. I'm not suggesting that we have clarity as to why this is happening. I am suggesting that this is a time, much like a pregnancy, in which we're incubated, in which we're in a set of circumstances which doesn't allow us to live freely as we've become accustomed to. But hey, we can all dream. We can all optimistically look forward to a new life, to the notion of Tazria or Chaim Chadashim. We will get through this. Please God, we will come through this stronger and better. And we will come through this, hopefully, with a new appreciation of social interaction, a new appreciation of the value of friendship, a new appreciation of the beauty of being able to congregate together, a newfound appreciation for the ability for us to come to shul and to experience our Yiddishkeit together as a community as we're supposed to. So now's a beautiful time for us to think about how things will be different. Now that we've all tasted quarantine and social isolation, let's all think about the way we'll utilize the gifts of life when this gloomy situation finally comes to an end, when the sun does shine again, when we experience the bloom of new life, when we're able to re-embrace the kinds of lives that we became used to, enjoying the things we took for granted. Let's all make sure that out of this period will come extraordinary Tazria, seeding and fresh growth. And if we make up our minds to utilize the gifts that Hashem gives us wisely, appropriately, and appreciatively, I have no doubt that tomorrow will be sunnier and friendlier than yesterday was. And that Be'ezrat Hashem, together, we'll be able to go from strength to strength as we continue to hope and yearn for the coming of Mashiach each and every single day. Thank you.